Hi and welcome. Today in this episode we are reviewing a 19th century masterpiece by the late Dr. Martin Luther King. Now this historic, monumental and iconic speech was given at the Lincoln Memorial in an event famously dubbed the 1963 March on Washington. And what we're going to be doing is to basically appreciate the content and context of this speech while we point out the techniques, tactics and guidelines we believe Dr. King exploited, observed and followed in order to develop, deliver or pronounce such a compelling and galvanizing speech. And in his opening paragraph, Dr. King says, "I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation." Now that, friends, constitutes what to the classical orators is the introduction. A few things to point out about this part of the speech. Now, ordinarily, it sought to achieve two things. The first is this is where the orator or speaker sought to ingratiate himself with the audience. And by ingratiating, I mean they sought to favorably dispose themselves with their audience. We do not have an overt instance of this function in this particular speech, but we see it in another of Dr. King's speeches, and that is "I have been to the mountaintop." So if you check that out, you will realize how Dr. King opens up his speech by jestfully or playfully making a funny but yet strategic remark that created a picture or an impression of himself to the audience as a humble, down-to-earth and grounded gentleman. So what is at play usually is the ethical appeal, right? We paint a picture of ourselves as people who are benevolent, people with goodwill or profound knowledge on the topic or whatever subject we will be talking about. In this part or function of the introduction, it is inevitable that the orator has to make mention or to point to themselves, point to their achievements. But even in so doing, utmost attention and discretion must be undertaken to not come off as proud, gloating or hubristic. So you can't be explicit. But the second part of the introduction usually is to inform the audience. So this is where you point up to what your subject matter is really all about, what you're going to be treating in the main body of your speech. Another rule, your introduction must be enough, and enough connotes something relative. What are some of the factors that may influence or dictate what you do in this part of the speech? The first thing could be the nature of the subject matter you are treating. The second could be the nature of the audience you are facing. The third could be the occasion, right? Personalities. Back to Dr. King's introduction. The first observation is he makes his introduction short. Other orators have longer introductions, but like I said, it squares back to the logic that we just mentioned earlier. There could be many reasons why he chose a rather short introduction, and I have a few assumptions. The first evident thing is when you go through Dr. King's speeches, and including this particular one in question, you realize that shorter statements is his idiosyncrasy, consistent with his writings, right? So probably his style. The second assumption is there had been a whole line of speakers before Dr. King. So by the time he came in, the people were probably tired, bored, and they were in the sun. So I assume that he thought it wasn't necessary to extend their plight by extrapolating or dragging his introduction. That observation is Dr. King dispenses with talking about himself. Like when he comes on stage, he gets right down with what he's supposed to do. He doesn't introduce himself, he doesn't try to ingratiate himself, because clearly he knew the audience, and being the religious leader, civil activist, he was already famous in the American society. But also the person that had prior introduced him had successfully done that.